Planning an event and wondering how you can give your attendees the best experience possible? Take advantage of customized meetings with Hilton that make it easier than ever to incorporate health, wellness, and great breaks. Hilton will help you build an extraordinary meeting that attendees will remember. To book your next meeting or event, go to meetings.hilton.com.
Are you followers?
Okay, so we're gonna probably add.
Welcome to GatherGeeks, a podcast by BizBash, the place where people passionate about meetings and events come together. Here are your hosts, BizBash CEO David Adler and Editor-in-Chief Beth Kormanik.
Hi, David.
Hey, Beth, here we are, another GatherGeeks podcast.
Our guests today are Taylor, Buonocore, Guthrie, and Mollie Kinsman Khine of Conversate. They facilitate group discussions and specialize in the Jeffersonian Dinner concept. They even created a game that helps people facilitate their own conversations. So the game tackles subjects like creativity, community differences, work, parenthood, and bravery, among other things. But for their consulting work, they facilitate conversations that are part of sales training, focus groups, fundraising, and other subjects more related to the world of work. But before we start, David, give us a definition, just a basic definition of what a Jeffersonian dinner party is.
Well, basically, it's a curated conversation where you give people permission at a dinner party to have one conversation around the table, as opposed to everybody just sort of talking to their neighbor and sort of having sort of conversations that are not planned. And my feeling is I always say that have you ever been to a dinner party where you never talk to the person at the other end of the table ever? So you really don't know who's even there, even if it's a dinner party for 12 or 20. And so this solves that problem in that it goes deeper. And that's what I love about the Jeffersonian Dinner Party. And I think the reason that we're doing this is because I've become a huge fan of it. We do it all the time for our speaker dinners, before any kind of our trade shows. And it actually, I think, empowers people the next day to be more a part of something.
Mm-hmm. And so, once again, this is not a concept just for personal entertaining at dinner parties. This concept works at conferences or networking luncheons, all types of gatherings. And as you mentioned, we practice what we preach. We use it here at BizBash. So the conversation we're about to listen will give a how-to if you want to try this yourself, as well as make the case for why it's important. So let's listen.
I love this concept of the Jeffersonian Dinner Party. It's what has brought us together. And we're kind of having a little mini Jeffersonian Dinner Party right now that people can listen in on. So I want to first start with, Taylor, what brought you into this whole Jeffersonian Dinner Party, and why are we connecting so much on this?
Yeah, so Jeffersonian Dinner, it's like the new hot way to gather people in a meaningful way, right? I first learned about the concept while working with Jennifer McCrae, who co-authored with Jeff Walker, The Generosity Network. And a big part of that book actually talks about the Jeffersonian Dinner. It's a way essentially to gather people for meaningful dialogue. It gets its name from one of our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, who was known to gather people from around the region at his personal dinner table as a way to share ideas and exchange knowledge, basically. And he was known for moderating and facilitating these conversations.
He was always a take charge kind of guy.
Yeah.
Right. And he took charge of his dinner
and
parties.
perhaps this is one of the best things that he should be known for.
Yes.
Is gathering people like this.
And tell us in a nutshell, what is it? When you have to explain it to your mother,
yeah.
Like, how do you explain it?
Yeah, which has been done, right?
Okay.
So it's essentially everybody gets together around a table. You share a table, you share a meal, and you share a conversation. And when you typically go to a dinner party, you're probably used to being at a long rectangular table. You talk to the people that are on your left and right. You miss out on conversation that's happening at the other end. The Jeffersonian style dinner party brings everybody together for one conversation.
And does the conversation continue throughout the entire dinner party, or does it break up in terms of different approaches?
When we do it, it stays as a single conversation the whole time. And the important thing that guides the conversation, there's a couple. One is a theme or a topic. So the group convenes to discuss a common theme that's supported by a series of question prompts. which are delivered by a facilitator. That's the other really important part of a Jeffersonian dinner. That facilitator throws out prompts to the table as a way of inviting conversation to flow, and they help the conversation to move from question to question. They invite people who perhaps aren't speaking to speak, and they ultimately just guide the conversation so that it stays on as a whole table.
And how many people are involved in a perfect size Jeffersonian
Perfect size? Well, we've facilitated them anywhere from like 3 people all the way to 20 people. I think the sweet spot is at about 10 to 12.
10 to 12. Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Well, let's go to Mollie, who is your partner in crime on this. These are 2 moms that have gone professionally and are rethinking their lives a little bit and really realize that this is a really interesting approach to connect people. So Mollie, tell us, what's your connection to Jefferson?
Sure. Well, I actually sort of stumbled upon the format before realizing there was a name for it. Time is precious. Weeknights are precious. And I found myself frustrated with the lack of structure and depth at a typical happy hour networking event. That being said, I realized just how many multicultural, diverse people have these unique stories that didn't seem to be aligning, either in my own conversations at a happy hour or in overhearing others. So I started hosting folks at my home, small group in my New York City apartment, and I would choose a topic that really spoke to me.
So go through what the process was. Did you came up with the topic before you had the dinner, or did you do the topic when people got there?
No, so I would choose a topic in advance, and that would inform who I had invited. So it was very much about curating.
Give me an example of your first one.
Exactly. First one was actually a financial discussion. So it was about personal finance. I found this to be a topic that people seemed eager to speak about, but was rare to find yourself comfortable in a social setting, opening up about your view towards finances. So we gathered. I invited folks and importantly set the expectation that this would be a topic-driven, conversation-focused meal.
Was it new to people?
It was new. Yeah.
Isn't that surprising?
It's very surprising. Because as Taylor mentioned, so often you just find yourself up to your own devices to strike up a conversation, hope for some commonalities, maybe talk about the weather and then some. But folks left those parties raving about not my food, I'm a terrible cook, but instead the conversation. And they all learned something and were already eager for the next.
And so what is your technique for starting it off? I mean, how do you get people jazzed about it from the minute one? Because I think that's part of the key to success. And I'm a big proponent of these. 100%.
This makes all the difference. I think there's a really big part of the events industry at large that's just focused on the things, right? The setting, the space, the food. For me, as a facilitator and as a coach, my mind immediately goes to the experience. So setting expectations was important. My invitations were very specific as to introduce folks to what is a Jeffersonian dinner? How does this work? What's expected of you? Arriving on time, being engaged, getting excited. And when people arrived, they were eager to get started. I find limiting the sort of small talk time at the beginning, starting on time. And one thing that I find really important is to have everyone sit at the same time. So not having folks choose a seat early, but instead starting the conversation when everyone's seated. And what is that introduction? Go take us through the scenario. You're sitting there facilitating, people sit down, what happens next? Yeah, so when folks take a seat, I like to introduce the history of a Jeffersonian dinner. I think there's something really special about recognizing that this is something that never goes out of style. And what is the history of this? And from your perspective, we've heard a little bit from Taylor's. Great. So to me, the Jeffersonian dinner gets its name from President Jefferson. I just imagine this big lavish table and these folks traveling for days and miles to come share a meal and to learn from each other. And to me, that's always been the key. I find people infinitely fascinating. And so when you give an opportunity and enough structure to invite that blows my mind every time. But so setting the stage, effectively welcome, a welcome by the host is such a critical part that's often missed. I find going to events, strolling around and wondering, what exactly am I here to achieve?
And you know that at events, most people don't even talk to each other. No, most people don't talk to anyone at most events. And I'm railing against the CEOs who are the worst hosts in the world. They do not know how to be a host at an event. And I think that this Jeffersonian thing teaches you a little bit about what people really want.
Yeah.
So go through so you do the introduction. What is the first question you have, and how do you get it to go around the room?
Absolutely. First question is an icebreaker. Everybody knows the term icebreaker. You get a lot of eye rolls from the term icebreaker.
Oh, yeah.
So for us, an icebreaker question is something that is, without being cheesy, just easy to answer. It doesn't require a lot of vulnerability, doesn't require a lot of thought. But importantly, the icebreaker gets words to come out of everyone's mouth at least once.
Right.
And once you've spoken once, you're more likely to speak again, and you're more comfortable doing so. So we've developed kind of a type of icebreaker that allows usually a sharing of an experience and a leveling of hierarchy. For example, you're throwing your bios out the window in this icebreaker, and you're simply sharing a memory. Memories are good ones. A moment, those kinds of prompts invite someone and kind of level the playing field.
And so, like, I'll tell you what I do with these, and I'd love to hear what you're doing. I believe, and I don't know where I learned this from, that people like to talk about what they did before they were 20, because it definitely levels the playing field. Mm-hmm. And I do several different questions, especially in the event industry when I have an event team. And one of the first ones I did was, what was your first job? Mm. And that is always a good one. We've done, who was your first teacher and why? And that opens up a huge discussion. We've done, who would be your mentor in history if you could choose anyone? And you see the through lines go completely through the entire dinner party, but it's the job of the facilitator to create the through lines, I believe. And what do you guys, what do you do? Taylor, what do you do?
Yeah, well, for opening questions, one of our favorite ones is, what's something small or unexpected that brings you joy? We've also used, who's your favorite person to call when you have good news? I find that the positive spin on the icebreaker too sets a nice tone for the dinner, because people are ultimately sharing things that are important to them throughout this meal, and it's a gentle way to get them to do it in the beginning.
And what are some of the common denominator answers when you say,
well, I'll tell you, I just facilitated a corporate group last week. They're, I suppose, a startup more than a corporate. A lot of people talked about humans that are important to them, which speaks to the connection that we're all looking for in life, right? Everybody shared some person that was important to them in some way. 2 people shared about their cat, but to me, that qualifies as the same.
Yeah.
Some living, breathing thing that's in your life that's important to you. Yeah.
And Mollie, how about you? What is your sort of go-to first question?
Go-to question for me just needs to be topic aligned. It needs to not seem random. So I love the first job question. There's always comic
I get a lot of ice cream scoopers.
Ice cream scoopers, golf cart drivers. Yeah, that's a great one.
I always also ask people, what did they learn from their first job that they use today? Mm-hmm. And every single person has an infinite amount of experience from that first job that has defined their lives.
Yeah.
And a few people are a CEO in their first job, right? So speaking of leveling the playing field, everybody can relate to that ice cream scooper experience.
Yeah. And then you find out what the favorite ice cream people ordered, and it becomes really interesting. Not everyone liked Rocky Road.
Yeah.
So you go through, what I have a problem sometimes is that you get to the first question and everybody is so jazzed about the first question. How do you keep the conversation from getting dull, and everybody wants to answer that first question in much more depth than you really want? How do you sort of say no?
For the opening intro, I like to do a round robin, kind of know when it's your turn, conversation flows. Then I like to pitch a really, really big open question to start. Then we can narrow in after that. The round robin works well to start, but after that, I just ask people to jump in.
What is the big position question?
Big position. So let's say our topic is meaningful work. the first question might be, what does meaningful work mean to you? Just to start out high level to make sure we're all speaking about the same thing.
And then how do you keep that interesting? Do you actually choose who's going to speak, or do you do a round robin again? What is the facilitation tool that you use for that?
Facilitation tool there is just to open it up to the group. It'll very quickly become apparent who's going to be chatty, who's going to be more quiet. And then later on, I'll call on specific people.
But is the key calling on people?
I love to call on people.
Yes, right. How about Taylor? Are you a caller on people type of?
Yeah, I have been known to do that. But I think we have also found that different formats work for different groups. So as Mollie mentioned, you can see even in the icebreaker who's going to share a lot and who maybe feels less comfortable, at least in the beginning. And if you have a smaller group, it's easier to do the round robin over and over and over again.
Right.
In fact, a lot of groups I've been with want to do the round robin.
Right,
because
no one wants to miss out.
Yeah, and there's an expectation, like I wait my turn and now it's my turn to speak. Some people don't feel comfortable, jumping in with exactly what they want to share with the group. So the round robin can help just continue that structure and the comfort.
How about the level of, even though people don't want to be vulnerable, how do you see as the facilitator the level of vulnerability, and how do you kind of tweak it a little bit to make sure that people are more intimate without making people feel uncomfortable?
So there's a very specific technique here when introducing that vulnerability component. First comes in the icebreaker. If you nail it with a memory, with a meaningful person, they're already sharing a little bit of themselves. Then it's notching it back to say, all right, we've all shared a little bit. Let's talk about something more intellectual, something more kind of broad.
Like if we're talking about travel, for example, one of the questions that we'll use as our first question is a thought-provoking one. So is wanderlust and a desire to explore something we're all born with, or is it something that you either have or you don't have? That's like high level enough, right? That somebody can answer it on an intellectual level, but it also potentially invites some personal sharing.
So before we go on, I want to sort of let everybody that cannot see what we're doing is that these folks have created a product called Conversate, which allows people to have basically a Jeffersonian dinner party in a box. Do you want to explain what this is to help people, Taylor?
Yeah, sure. Well, really quickly, Mollie and I just felt like this format was so powerful, and we wished that everybody had access to it. And what we were hearing from folks that attended the dinners or who we shared this idea with are that there were a couple barriers to actually getting to this point in conversation, whether it was that someone wasn't sure what to talk about or that they didn't feel comfortable facilitating. And we decided to package this in a box so that anybody who was interested in creating this kind of dialogue would have all the tools that they need to be able to do it. So
describe, since we're on radio, what's in the box.
So inside the box, you have a series of conversation cards.
Like a lot. I mean, there's how many?
Yeah, there's 30 in the box.
There's 30 of different, and give us an example of some of those conversation topics.
So some of them are travel, like we just mentioned. We have sort of the obvious big topics like family and friendship, spirituality, parenthood. And then we have some that are a little bit more off the beaten path, like the topics of survival or bravery. Endurance is one that I really like. Impermanence, these like capital letter topics, right? That everybody can relate to by virtue of being alive. You have something to say about this topic.
And so basically what you're doing is you're giving a facilitator the guiding questions for the most part. So this box is for the facilitator. In many cases, it's the cheat sheet.
It is. And we created, Mollie and I packed everything that we know into this thing. So it's got a little pocket guide for if you're the facilitator. Some of the common concerns are like, what if one person dominates the conversation?
Okay, what if one person dominates the conversation? You're asking the questions that I want to ask.
Yeah, well, if one person dominates the conversation, you need to gently wrestle the conversation away from that person,
okay,
right? But in a way
how do you do that?
Well, Mollie talked before about calling on specific people. That's actually a great way to tackle that moment. It serves as a signal to everyone else at the table that you're curious to learn from other people without you having to say, your time is up. We want to hear from others.
How about, is interrupting a technique that works, or do you have to be very careful about that?
I interrupt easily. I think it's important because in order for this to be successful, it needs to stay relatively on theme. And so I think everyone kind of appreciates a productive interruption.
So as I'm interrupting you right now, an aggressive facilitator raises the energy by interrupting a little bit. So a certain amount of non-rude interruption makes sense. But I think if you tell people in advance you're going to interrupt them, it also is helpful.
Absolutely.
You do that?
And using the sort of and the question prompts, it's really easy to say, so let's pivot back to the next question.
And that's on the cards.
And it's on the cards.
And so, okay, what are the other things that I interrupted you on that one? What are the other?
So the conversation cards are key, right? Because that gives you the topic and the questions, which we heard from people were a big barrier to actually making this experience happen.
And sorry for interrupting again, but I think it makes it more interesting.
Yeah, we are so comfortable with that.
Okay, good. Of the topics, like, what is your bestseller in this sense? Like, what do people really want to talk about when they're not like when all of the lights are not shining on them?
Well, we often will curate the topic. So Mollie and I are choosing topics or are working with a client to pick the topic. But a fun thing to do is to actually hand the stack to someone and let them flip through and see what they're interested in doing when we do this with a group that we know better. And it varies by person. Honestly, when we look back at these, we feel like we love them all. I mean, we want to talk about all 30 of these topics and the 50 others that we have, in a Google Doc that we're ready to develop.
We're going to take a little break and come right back after this message from Hilton. So when's the big event? Hilton's here for planners with their exclusive customized meetings. Become a wow maker and save time by letting Hilton help you present an extraordinary event, one that leads to memorable and meaningful connections. Visit meetings.hilton.com and let Hilton help you. So one of the other areas that I find in this sort of conversation, I call event organizers not event organizers anymore. I call them collaboration artists, because that's what you really are. And the use cases for this in any type of situation seems to be well done in a sense, whether it's learning and development or it's a big topic. What experience do you have in the use cases that this works the best in?
I love this question because I think this can be used in nearly any setting.
I'm on the same page. So
Yeah,
I'm throwing you a softball here.
Well, they range really. And what I find interesting about it is it's completely up to the host, to the event planner, to decide on the level of formality, the level of sophistication. This can be done around a campfire with some s'mores and a facilitator mom who wants to engage her children, to literally a gala alternative where you're engaging your funders or your board members in a way that brings them back to their own reason for being a supporter.
Can you do this in a large setting too, by tables, or does it not work that way well?
So what I found for a larger setting, for me, I've done a corporate one, 70 people. We did 7 tables of 10. Mm-hmm. And in our case, we brought in a facilitator for each table.
Each one. That's important, right?
That's critical. I've also seen them done where you sort of empower an individual at the table and they become the dedicated facilitator. But they really range. They range from, the fundraising events you mentioned, conference add-on events before a conference, getting your attendees or your speakers to connect and get on the same page.
I was mentioning before this that I do these before every big conference I have for the speakers. And the next day, the speakers are 10 times more effective in speaking, and they feel totally more connected to the audience and to the people that they're meeting, the other speakers. And it's one of the most effective things I've ever done. And in fact, it's my favorite part of every conference.
Well, even following a conference too, as an attendee or a guest, you find yourself maybe really interested or energized by something that was said, yet there's not often a forum to debrief with the folks who are sitting around you. So even being invited to a table afterwards to sort of let that content sink in for yourself, I think is a missed opportunity in many cases.
Well, I've been with the guys from IDEO and some of the big agencies, and they say that that surveys are terrible, that observational research is the best, but I would assume that this is like a mini focus group is probably even better than all of them. Mm-hmm. Do you have Caller, do you have comments on that?
Yeah. And I would say just generally the versatility of the format of the Jeffersonian Dinner is when you take the core components. So we're able to talk about using this with everything from a gala that Mollie mentioned to an onboarding retreat for a brand new team to, using guiding discussion questions, because the key is to have that facilitator who has prepared question prompts, which are thoughtful, and that everybody participates together, right?
So actually on that point, so let's say you have a defined group of people and work in a company. Is it more important for people to connect in, I call it intentional humanism, as opposed to the actual content of whatever company that they are involved in? Is it the human connection that's more important than the education or the knowledge of product, let's say?
Yeah, well, the two go hand in hand, I think probably is the answer to that. My background is actually in learning and development and talent management. So this question really speaks to my professional grounding. And that's how I first started using these dinner formats, hiring a team of people that did not know each other, needed to ramp up exceptionally quickly to tackle a very big problem, not in the United States for that matter. And to be able to get these people together and working fluidly, I found the Jeffersonian Dinner model to be essential. So in my personal opinion, I feel like the relationship comes first.
It trumps everything else?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to get to a content discussion if you don't trust the people that you're talking to, right?
Well, every conversation I've had on this podcast and on other things comes back to Maya Angelou, in that people don't remember what you said. They remember how you made them feel.
Yes.
And totally. What about this? What is the feeling? I mean, it's hard to articulate this, but what do you get what do you feel when you do a Jeffersonian style dinner party?
I'll tell you what I feel.
What is the, I get goosebumps. What do you get?
I feel like I'm seeing energy in the room. Like I see electricity flowing between people, which I think Mollie and I often say this is epitomized by the hug between two people who come as strangers. Mm-hmm. And these two people show up, nobody knows each other at the table. And at the end of the conversation, you see multiple pairs of people either exchanging a really warm handshake or literally hugging each other. Yeah. And it reminds me of this quote from Brené Brown, like vulnerability is being seen by someone else. Yes. And like we were starting to talk about vulnerability being this like buzzword that everybody is saying, it's intimidating to a lot of people. Yeah. But I think this format of conversation achieves vulnerability in an extremely approachable and non-confrontational way.
Right. Well, she calls vulnerability the ultimate in courage and innovation and things like that. Mm-hmm. That if you're vulnerable, you are really in the forefront of breakthrough.
Yeah.
And things like that.
Mollie, I'm curious your answer to that question.
Mollie, what's your feeling? You get goosebumps?
I just feel wildly energized. Yeah. Every time I leave the table, I go home and immediately start working on the next.
I'm feeling that just in our conversation today.
Exactly. No, we often use the term arrive as strangers and leave as friends because it's very common for folks to show up to the table not knowing anyone there. And hugs, handshakes, there is no doubt in my mind these relationships continue well beyond.
One of the things that I've been writing about and studying is this concept at events of intentional humanism. With AI coming down the pike and people like being so enamored with technology, it's still Jefferson is still the guy before they had social media that we're still talking about. And it's something about the oxytocin exchange between people that happens when you talk and when you exchange ideas that is sort of the intersection of what life's about, in a sense.
And that tech-free comment, too, I find that to be some feedback that we get is, wow, this is the first time I haven't picked up my phone in 3 hours. That was so refreshing. 100%
get the same. People are so engaged. And they're listening to the next person and they're rooting for the next person when you do these events.
We've also seen too, I haven't done it at all of the events, but I've seen a phone box, and folks put their phone in the box before they sit down at the table. Yeah. Certainly a voluntary act, but it's sort of that intention of being there present with the folks that you're dining with.
Yeah. Speaking of intention, we should make sure we talk about takeaways.
Okay.
Do you do takeaways?
I do. I go around. I view it as this is group therapy. And I do, what did you learn from tonight? And it is in 30 seconds a person. And it is the most powerful part of the evening. And it's affirmation that people are afraid to say, oh my God, this is fantastic. I don't know. What do you got? What do you do, Taylor?
We love takeaways too. And in the box set, we have cards because there's a ton of research that shows when you write down insights, they have the power to stick a little bit more.
I haven't written them down. So people, you have them write them down?
Yep. We invite people to write them down. If the whole thing is show up how you feel comfortable. So,
right.
But pretty much everybody, I'd say 99% of people write their takeaway down and they can keep the written piece. A lot of people put it on a vision board or, up on the fridge.
I have not used that. That's I'm gonna
it's a nice takeaway that like solidifies the experience. And I think as a host, you can do this on scraps of paper, but it gives people a little tangible memory of that experience that they shared together.
How about you? Do you have,
you've probably seen
Mollie?
this. You've probably seen this plenty yourself, but to me, what is so interesting is that the same conversation is experienced by everyone at the table, yet each person takes away something slightly different.
Totally agree with that.
Without fail. And I think stating those takeaways aloud kind of speaks to that internalization of a person's experience.
I totally agree. It's just amazing how also I use it for me personally to be, I consider myself like I view my life as like I'm the mayor of the event industry. So I've got to sort of see what's going on. And I get, as a facilitator, so much more out of the people at the table are not getting nearly what I'm getting out of it. I don't know. What do you think, Taylor?
I would agree. But at the same time, I've heard you talk with a lot of your guests about like the gift of the event and the gift of the experience. And to us, this is like the ultimate gift.
Yeah.
I mean, that people have said that to us when they leave these dinners, but it truly is when you're facilitating, you're participating in the conversation too.
Yes.
If you feel comfortable, sharing your own perspective and facilitating, but the experience that you're giving people as a host, whether you're a corporate, in corporate HR, or you're a CEO convening other business leaders, or you're a newlywed who's hosting some other friends you've just met in the neighborhood, like it is such a gift to gather people for that 2.5 hours or however long you gather. 6-hour interesting conversation to convene people for that and let them share and learn and leave with something.
That brings me to that question about time. How much, people don't want to leave. What is the normal time frame for this experience, in your opinion? We'll start with Mollie. Why don't you start with it?
So I think just as a dart, 3 hours is the right time.
3 hours.
Give or take the formality. If you're doing multi-courses, it's going to extend longer. If you're doing something less formal, 1.5 hours to 2 hours can do the trick.
An hour is too short.
An hour is too short, yeah.
Yeah. A lot of people want to package this. Mm-hmm. They're interested in the format. They want to do it, but they're like, we're short on time. Let's do it in an hour. What we'll find is that you get really rolling at about 35, 40 minutes. And then when you have to close it down at an hour, everybody feels really disappointed.
And then what is the food conversation track going on? Do you just start serving the food right away? Do you start talking first? What is your normal takeaway? Who wants to get you and Mollie? You want to?
Yeah, my suggestion is either family style works quite well. I think it supports the sort of shared experience because you have to ask someone to pass the plate and you're increasing your interaction there. Alternatively, private room at a restaurant works great. Inform the staff certainly that this is a conversation focused intention and oftentimes they can time the courses to match the questions.
So do you do the first go around while the appetizer is already being served? I mean, these are really practical questions, but they come up and I've been thinking about it all the time.
Yeah. So I like to, when I have everyone seated in the beginning, I like to have food start in that moment to sort of do that with the welcome and say, let's dive in. This is a formal part of our evening. However, help yourself, refills, let's keep this fun. And I think just sort of giving permission in that moment to dive into the food as the conversation ensues is a really important aspect.
Is the food secondary in this? No matter how fantastic the food is, do you still have to salute the food? And I mean, I always thank the chef and I always do all the things but people are so engaged that they're sometimes not looking at the food. Taylor.
Depends. We've done food and story Jeffersonian dinner. So in that case, the food is integral to the experience. Same thing if you do this low key and low budget as a potluck. You can invite each person to bring a dish, and then the food becomes a special part. Yeah, they can talk about their dish, or, everybody sort of begins, just like the icebreaker invites everyone to contribute. The potluck, by the virtue of walking in the door, people have already started to contribute something to the experience that you're all sharing.
And what I've found is that sometimes I break it up a little bit while everyone is eating and give people a moment to eat in the middle of it sometimes, depending on the flow of the room. And then we go back to talking afterwards. I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
I can see how that could work.
Yeah.
I've never really needed to do it, maybe because it tends to be a larger group. So part of the beauty of this model, I think, is that with one person speaking, it's not like when you dine just 2 or 3 people and you're sort of voraciously chewing your food, trying to be ready to share your next point, right? Or respond to another person. It actually takes the energy down in some ways, because you get to chew comfortably, and then you don't have to worry that you need to be the next one to speak, because there's 8 other people at the table who could also jump in.
How do you deal with shy people? How do you pull people out of their, you must get this all the time. How do you get the people that are terrified to speak in public? And a lot of people are.
A lot of people are. And I have a big smile on my face because I actually had a request from an introvert who attended one of these dinners to do a special dinner for introverts.
I love that.
And so that has become a favorite topic with some event partners of ours who host networking as an introvert as the topic for the dinner. And so people self-select. They show up, in some cases, really reserved, really shy, and all of them are more chatty than our fellow extroverts are by the end of it. So
what do you do? How do you get them to be comfortable enough to do that?
It's the structure. In my view, it's the structure. I think people, if left to their own devices, that social anxiety can set in. It certainly does for me if I'm in a big enough room and everyone's laughing and having a great time. This structure is inviting. It sets people at ease. It helps them understand how to engage with others, what's expected of them. And then people make it their own. And I just find this so-called introverts to be wildly talkative and very, very, very fun and engaging.
And the idea that social anxiety is such a big part of what's going on in the world today is really because we're not dealing with it properly. Do you think that, Taylor?
Yeah, well,
we're not giving people permission to talk to each other.
Yeah, yes. And like anything, practice helps make us better.
Yep.
And so what Mollie and I think a lot about is how to ask a good question. I think for those of us who are really keen to engage, for the folks that are less comfortable engaging, it's your job to ask a compelling and a comfortable question for that person. And that is, in my opinion, definitely a learned skill. I think you can be naturally socially inclined, but it takes a lot of work to actually think through the questions, which for me was a huge part of being excited about creating this product was because I felt like I want to have these conversations. And I mean, I'm one of the people that developed this thing, and I still will get out a conversation card and use our own questions to guide the dialogue because it just makes it easier for me. I've already thought about these things, and now I can ask the question in a way that feels really genuine because I'm not spending so much time in my head trying to create the tone and the phrasing and the words and make sure that it feels just right to make someone comfortable to answer.
You're iterating on top of iterating.
Yeah.
Let's move a little bit on to, as we sort of close a little bit, you guys are trying to create a business out of this, and you're successfully productizing it, and you are so passionate about it. I mean, I'm totally on the bus, by the way. Tell us about how people can have you assist them in this process.
Yeah. Well, we'd be happy to talk about that because, again, the genesis of this was really like becoming a go-to product to help people have more meaningful connection and create opportunities for people to learn. And that goes for personal and professional. We have used this in both environments. We feel like it's equally effective in both. So we actually launched this on Kickstarter and feel like it's important to kind of shout out the folks that backed the campaign, because this was a Kickstarter campaign at the very beginning. And the crowd agrees that meaningful conversation is valuable and it's an effective way to engage. Mollie and I took that seed funding and built this box. And now we're on Amazon.com. We are on uncommongoods.com. And we, in addition to having the product, really like to share sort of thought leadership, to use a buzz term, right? Like, how do you actually implement this sort of thing? So we're constantly doing guest posts with different organizations. We write some of our own blog content.
What's the name of your website or your?
The website is conversate.com.
Spell it
it's
for people.
CONVERS with a hyphen, ATE.com. And we're on Instagram as well, where we share, a little lighter content, but again, things that are meant to inspire, quotes from the great conversationalists, of our time.
Oh, okay. That asks the question: who are the great conversationalists of our time?
Well, I'll share my personal.
Okay.
My personal
and
one.
then Mollie, you got. I need yours.
I'll share one that's perhaps off the beaten path. I love Krista Tippett. I think she brings a level of presence to her conversations.
Tell us who she is.
So she founded an organization called On Being, and she interviews really fascinating individuals who, perhaps I'm out of the know, but a lot of the time I don't recognize the names of the people that she's speaking with, but they are, I think, by virtue of her question asking and their backgrounds, the conversation is just enthralling every single time.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, Mollie, who's yours?
Yeah, well, I'm going to go with an organizational psychologist, Adam Grant. I'm just continuously inspired by him, and I think his curiosity and approach towards connection and meaning.
What does he do that makes you want to listen and talk and think from him?
Yeah, so his focus is a lot around meaningful work, and I find that to be a space where you're interacting with your colleagues consistently, but maybe not at a level of depth in the personal realm. So I think what I learned from Adam Grant is to take that curiosity lens throughout your day, whether that's the added follow-on question when someone shares a story, instead of saying a shift response, right? Me too, I can relate to that, and shifting that towards yourself, a support response like tell me more is going to level up that conversation.
And is that a guide for how you facilitate now too?
It plays a role, certainly. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I just was with a group the other day to bring that to life, and we did an icebreaker, and someone shared, I think we were talking about the first home that you lived in, and everybody was sharing. It came to the second person, and she said, I grew up in Virginia, in a regular house. And she answered the question, right? But there was so much more to that question. So I said, what was unique about that house? Now, maybe that's diving into the question set, but in this case, it's meant to set the stage and the expectation that it's okay to share more. And we continued on with the other 5 people, and these happen to be college kids actually, and all the rest of them shared. And at the end, one of the kids in the group said, isn't that interesting how much we all just learned about each other in the icebreaker? And not
Totally.
to, pat the facilitator on the back, but I thought to myself, this is one of those learning moments where if you don't ask that follow-up question, everybody else sort of feels like, I'm just supposed to say the state and the kind of house that I grew up in, instead of sharing a little bit more.
Totally. I ended up doing that when I do who is your favorite teacher and why? The why part was so interesting that became the through line through the whole thing, that their third grade teacher recognized them as human. I mean, the things that are just, you just want to oh my God, I relate to that so much.
And that why, I think we would say, breaks someone out of thinking about a traditional teacher.
Yeah.
Like, who was your teacher and who was your teacher? Who was your first teacher? You're immediately going to think of school. When you say why, to me, that broadens it out. Now I can think about anybody that has taught me something. Right.
It's so interesting. So who is the question I would have to end is, this is such an incredibly powerful vehicle. Who should be experts in this in terms of, is the CEO of the company should be practicing this in all of his work? Should the person that is the collaboration artist in a company doing this, having their own personal dinner parties with their own personal brand on this kind of stuff? I mean, this is something that is intellectual capital at its finest. And the fact that most people are not doing it is surprising. I mean, what is your advice to people? I mean, people should, all their dinner parties should be this.
Yeah, I think the skill of asking great questions is valuable for anyone and everyone, whether you're walking down the street or you're the CEO of a Fortune 500 company.
Right.
The skill of asking questions is so important because it's what enables someone to be heard. It's what enables you to learn. It's what enables you to connect. This is what Mollie and I spend like all of our time talking about, is why is question asking so critical today? And we've talked about some of the cultural factors that are making it less common and more important. But I think this is like the skill of our time to be able to connect with people.
I totally agree. And if you notice, the best reporters in the world are the ones that ask questions in a very vulnerable way to get you to know them as well as or understand the subject. My favorite, I have a friend named Margaret Warner who works at McNeil Lehrer, I guess it's the NewsHour. She's the toughest reporter you'd ever met, but her interviews are so vulnerable and so real. That's why people talk to people. They want to connect. So, with that said, do you have any final? What are your key takeaways from this podcast? And how
Brilliant question.
And how should other people relate to what we're saying today?
So my key takeaway is podcasts are fun. To be sort of on the mic, to be around the mic. I've been listening to podcasts for years, but this is quite fun to be in the room. And as far as how people should be using this, I think if you consider yourself a ringleader, a gatherer of people, a collaboration artist, my challenge to you is to think about the people experience. And in addition to all of the elements of a well-run event, to put the conversation front and center, because that to me is the real meat and value of the experience for the attendees.
Very well said. Taylor, do you want to wrap us up here?
Yeah.
What's a key takeaway?
A key takeaway is the power of questions, right? I mean, it's reinforced every time we have these conversations. I've said things even in this interview and helped my ideas take shape in ways differently because of the questions that you asked us. So thank you on behalf of both of us for that. And yeah, it's the power of the question. You can literally start as soon as you turn off this podcast to practice asking people questions.
And the people that are doing this, there's a certain sort of aspect to people that take what we do seriously. And it's not about logistics, it's about strategy, and it's about human connection. So with that, I thank you for participating, and maybe we should have more conversations. And why don't we do a Jeffersonian style podcast with a group of people? And that would be really interesting.
Cool.
As the next step. So
Sounds
thanks,
good.
guys.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks, David, for that conversation. You know, they defended the icebreaker. The insight is once you've spoken once, you're more likely to share again, which I thought was important to note, and for people who are planning these things to think about how are you going to get people engaged. And the answer is start off with an icebreaker.
Yeah, I mean, and what's interesting is that when you talk about something in an icebreaker before you were 20 years old, it democratizes the room. Because no matter how important you are, when you're under 20, it doesn't matter what your position or status is, and it makes people connect in even deeper and richer ways.
Right. So you guys talked about really interesting examples of Jeffersonian dinner parties, and we've had really successful ones at BizBash. It's interesting though, you know, at times it can go off the rails a little bit, and despite the best efforts of a facilitator. And so it's interesting. I wonder what you think about this. You know, sometimes maybe the best thing a host can do is recognize that and decide this isn't going to work for this group.
Oh yeah,
What do you think?
I think that you got to feel the room. I mean, the job of the facilitator, it's exhausting to listen so carefully to everything that is going on. And sometimes when you get tired of listening, that's when it goes off the rails. It is a huge concentration effort to facilitate these things. And I think people underestimate the skill involved.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I have to ask at our next speaker dinner, when we do this, are we going to have a box for all of the phones? What do you think?
I think that's actually a good idea. I think, what's interesting is that when people are so engaged, they forget their phone is even there.
Right. Well, there's also more social pressure. If you're the one person at the table looking at your phone.
Oh, yeah.
People notice.
You get that hairy eyeball.
Right. Or you don't want to be called on by the facilitator and not be keeping up with the conversation.
Exactly.
So.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I love about one of our friends has this dinner party, which we talked about, I think, on the podcast on that if you don't participate, you have to sing. If you're the last person to play to be part of the conversation, you have to sing. So people want to participate so they don't have to sing, except for those people that love singing. So Beth, what's going on at BizBash?
Well, event planning is in the zeitgeist once again, in this time with 2 documentaries that were just released about the Fire Festival. So that is, as hopefully everybody knows by now, the influencer promoted music festival in the Bahamas that just turned into a disaster and resulted in the founder going to prison. So these are films that are really instructive for event planners on what not to do. So we have published a watching guide for the documentaries. One is on Hulu and one is on Netflix. And we're going to highlight the key takeaways and other insights for the event community.
This is definitely much must watching. I saw it last night and I thought it was fantastic from a lesson point of view. So before we end, we always like to thank the people that brought us this podcast, that worked on it with us. Claire Hoffman, who handles our editorial duties. Dave Nelson is our producer, and Rebecca Pappas is responsible for distributing it to all of you. So what do we say, Beth?
Gather on.
Gather on.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or your favorite podcast app. We can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Player FM, Google Play, and Pocket Cast. Be sure to leave us a rating and review. It helps others discover the GatherGeeks podcast. We'd also love to hear from you. You can leave feedback on Twitter @GatherGeeks or leave us an email, gathergeeks@bizbash.com. We hope you'll join us again for the next episode of GatherGeeks. Until then, gather on.